Hello, good evening, and welcome. My name is Leah Harder, and I'm a part of the In This Together steering committee. Peter Niemeyer and I will be co-hosting this event, and we have some of our other members here and more behind the scenes. And if you have any tech questions at all, you can use the chat feature and contact ITT Tech. There's Matt there who's ready to answer any questions you may have. If you aren't familiar with In This Together, who's hosting this webinar tonight, please feel free to check out our website, which is inthisTogetherNetwork.ca. And if you're not on our email list, you can add yourself through the website as well. This is the second webinar of our series, Faithfully at Variance, Engaging with the Confession of Faith in a Mennonite Perspective. If you didn't attend our first webinar, which was more about the history of confessions of faith and particularly the one in the Mennonite perspective, not to worry, we will be covering all new content tonight, which Peter will be introducing shortly. And a recording of the first webinar is also available on the In This Together's website if you're interested in checking that out. Before we move on, let's take some time to acknowledge the lands that we are tuning in from this evening. So I'm coming to you from Stouffville, Ontario, which is on the treaty territory of the Williams Nations. It's also the traditional territory of other Anishinaabe peoples, the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. So please feel free to write in the chat where you're at and what Indigenous groups first cared for the land, and feel free to include any treaty details you may have. You can go ahead and do that now. And as you're doing that, just a few housekeeping items before we get started. So everyone is going to be muted throughout the evening, other than our hosts and panelists. We do invite questions via the chat. So please use the chat feature to write all your questions in. You can do that throughout the presentations, and we'll take time at the end after our panelists have shared to engage with those questions. We will be recording the session tonight, but we will not be recording the Q&A and what follows. And we'll aim to wrap up in about 75 minutes, so that's a quarter past the next hour, depending on your time zone. And finally, we'd like to invite you all into a time of curiosity and learning. This is a time to hear stories and not to debate people's lived experiences. If you're interested in resources about inclusion or anything related, please feel free to reach out to a member of the In This Together team and we can help you out with that. So I'm going to turn things over to Peter Niemeyer now, who will be introducing the theme for the evening and our first speaker.
Good evening, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Peter Niemeyer. I live in Toronto, downtown Toronto. And as of yesterday, I am the full-time minister at Danforth Mennonite Church. So that's a little bit about my context. I'm on the steering committee with Mauricio Palacio and with Leah Harder and with Alyssa Bender and Matthew Froese for In This Together. And so one of the things that we thought of in terms of this webinar series is recognizing that we're approaching Mennonite Church Canada's gathering this coming summer. And we recognized that there were a number of churches that were starting to create and post online being at variance statements. And so we wanted to look at this question of the confession of faith because these being at various statements were indicating at how a particular congregation was at variance to the confession of faith. So we wanted to take a look in our first webinar around what is the role of a confession of faith within an Anabaptist context. So we wanted to have a bit more of a historical understanding. And so in our first webinar, we explored that focus of ways in which confessions of faith have been used and developed within a variety of different Anabaptist settings and contexts. Tonight's webinar, we wanted to make room for hearing queer stories in relationship to the confession of faith. And so our invitation to the panelists today is to share their stories, to share some of the history, to share current ways of being in relationship to the confession of faith. We will be hosting a third webinar, and I will say a little bit more about that at the conclusion. But just to give you a bit of a heads up, our third webinar will be around creative thinking in terms of how we can bear witness to what we're calling being faithfully at variance. And so wanting to call attention to invite more congregations to consider writing being at variance statements, but also to call upon the larger church to address LGBTQ justice issues related to Article 19 within the Confession of Faith as it relates to queer relationships and marriage. So we want to do some creative brainstorming, and so I'll say that or speak to that a little bit more near the end. So for this webinar, I want to introduce Eliot Chandler Burns. Eliot is pastor and theologian in Kitchener, Ontario. They pastor a small community-based ministry called Pastors in Exile, which works to provide meaningful faith experience to young adults on the margins of church. They serve on Mennonite Church Eastern Canada's Executive Council as assistant moderator. And in their spare time, they enjoy napping, craft beer, listening to Taylor Swift, and playing board games with their partner, Greg. So Eliot, I want to extend a warm welcome to you as you share your story, in relationship to the history of some of the queer relationships to the confession of faith. So I want to invite you now to come and take the platform here.
Thanks, Peter. I'm just pulling up what I want to say. Yeah, good to be here. So over the last few weeks, I've been growing more familiar with queer and LGBTQ plus Mennonite history, as I've prepared to bring story or set of stories here tonight. Growing up, I was part of a family whose story included queerness, even before I would come out or know myself to be queer or trans in any way. Just as I knew that the Sunday school stories of scripture that were taught from a young age, I grew up knowing stories of queer exclusion, queer protest, and radical love that risked upsetting the status quo. I heard stories of gay and lesbian people who left the church or were forced out of it based on their attractions. I heard stories of allies waiting outside the gates of church conferences or holding unsanctioned meetings to gather together LGBTQ plus folks and allies in the name of it advancing understanding and care in the church. As much as scripture, these oral stories shaped me. Now that I write academically and share stories more professionally, having broken memories of these orally passed on stories didn't feel like enough. So I began searching for some recorded version of these events. Brethren Mennonite Council for LGBTQ plus concerns has a number of videos online that tell stories of church meetings and motions, letter writing connections, churches' journeys towards becoming supportive communities, and individual stories. In addition, social media, for all its flaws, is a place of organizing and story sharing. I'd like to share some stories, some of the stories that I've found, before speaking further to how such stories formed me, and then I'll name some themes that I see throughout that resonate with the discussion of the role of Anabaptism in queer lives that are at variance with the Confession of Faith in a Mennonite perspective. The Brethren Mennonite Council for LGBTQ+ concerns was started in 1976 by Martin Rock, a gay man from the Church of the Brethren, who worked for MCC from 1966 to 1977. In 1977, he was fired from MCC after being outed as gay to his employer. He formed BMC in October 1976 as a way of connecting LGBTQ+ folks together, organizing the community and providing resources to the church and peer support to one another. The network formed first as informally LGBTQ+ folks connected with each other through letter writing. BMC began resourcing churches in the Brethren and Mennonite communities, first in the United States and later in Canada, spreading awareness of LGBTQ+ people in the church. Rock quickly began teaching and educating in seminars and talks, particularly in the Brethren context. BMC started a conversation that would continue into the Canadian Mennonite context. On January 3rd, 2025, Jeff Alteraz posted a story on the Pink Menno Campaign Facebook page of an event that happened in the spring of 1979. In Alteraz's post, he relayed a story from the perspective of Lauren Friesen, a professor emeritus at the University of Michigan. Lauren Friesen had been on the editorial committee for the Sing and Rejoice hymnal published by Herald Press in 1979. After reviewing hymns and sending them to press, a first printing of Sing and Rejoice was printed in spring 1979. On page 91 of the Sing and Rejoice was a new hymn called Praise the Lord, which in verse 3 stated, "Praising God is the privilege of all, black and white, straight and gay, old and young, short and tall." The committee in their deliberation had unanimously decided to include this hymn, including the line in the third verse. After publication, the committee received word that the text of the hymn was creating issues. At a Mennonite convention in Ontario that summer, the hymn book was to be introduced to the delegates, but pages 91 to 92 were missing, having been torn out of the book prior to the convention. A new printing was approved. Attempts were made to change the words. Due to copyright issues, the words could not be changed. Instead, it was eventually reprinted without the third verse. While this was a second printing, there is no recognition in the printing that it is a second edition, and many never knew about the first printing. The Mennonite Church's stance on homosexuality can be traced to statements on human sexuality passed in Saskatoon at a general meeting in 1986. Prior to that meeting, from 1981 to 1985, there was a committee created by the Mennonite Church and the General Conference Mennonite Church to develop a study guide relating to the topic of human sexuality, including homosexuality. For the meeting in Saskatoon in 1986, the General Board decided to make a statement on human sexuality for the delegates to vote on. Due to the fact that they were going to be voting on a statement, many churches decided not to engage the study guide. The study guide, called Human Sexuality in the Christian Life, called the church to err on the side of loving LGBTQ+ persons, studying sexuality diligently, develop and teach a Christian theology of the body, sex, and sexuality, which addressed homosexuality responsibly, to avoid judgmental labels, and to treat LGBTQ+ individuals as beloved people. The committee that created the study guide recommended that there not be a general statement made at the delegate meeting, since only 66 out of 200 congregations had bothered to engage the study guide. But the General Board of the General Conference Mennonite Church submitted and encouraged discussion of a passage of a statement that said, among other things, We understand the Bible to teach that sexual intercourse is reserved for a man and a woman united in marriage, and that violation of that teaching is a sin. It is our understanding that this teaching also includes premarital, extramarital, and homosexual sexual activity. The statement also included language about committing to remain together in loving dialogue with each other. There were 3 days of debate, and despite the committee's recommendation that the resolution not be voted on for fear it would shut down conversation, it was voted on and it passed, officially labeling homosexuality as a sin, and by many accounts shutting down opportunities for more conversation and learning. There has also been some conversation of the Confession of Faith that we've been a part of in these webinars. The Confession of Faith was adopted in 1995, but was in development from 1986 onward. There's some rhetoric that passes around saying that homosexuality wasn't part of the conversation when Article 19 of the Confession of Faith was being thought of and articulated. So we've heard in many places that Article 19 was developed with a lens not towards homosexuality, but towards marriage and divorce and singleness. And I'm sure that that's true, that much of the focus was on marriage and divorce and singleness. Yet in the language of the Confession of Faith, it is similar to the language of the Saskatoon Resolution on Human Sexuality. And we know that homosexuality was a live topic of conversation and division from these other stories that I've shared earlier. So it seems to be the topic of homosexuality was a live topic, just as the Committee for Writing the Confession of Faith and a Mennonite Perspective was getting off the ground in 1986. We can surmise that while it may not have been the active conversation around the Confession of Faith Writing Committee's table, they had likely been influenced in their language and understanding by the other conversations happening around the same time, namely the Resolution on Human Sexuality from Saskatoon in 1986. In 2007, Mennonite Church Canada launched the Being a Faithful Church process, which invited churches to study sexuality among their congregations, answering questions about their beliefs, commitments, and understandings of sexuality. The BFC process culminated in another resolution coming to the delegates of a Mennonite Church Canada conference, again in Saskatoon. The resolution, which passed with 85% of the vote, made room for churches to decide whether they differ from the beliefs set out in the Confession of Faith's Article 19. Since then, many churches have decided to become affirming congregations, making statements to allow membership, baptism and communion, calling of pastors, and inclusion for LGBTQ+ persons. Some churches have also created @Variance statements to specifically name that they differ from the beliefs set out in Article 19. Stories of MCC's HR policy or people losing their jobs because of their sexuality, churches being kicked out of conferences for allowing gay membership in their congregations, groups of queer people and their allies not being allowed to attend conferences were all common stories in my growing up years. For many years, I listened to these and other stories, attended church meetings, and heard rumors of conversations being shut down to protect the voices of the uncomfortable privileged. In my teens and early 20s, it seemed that every time I read the Canadian Mennonite magazine, there was something negative, usually quite hateful, being written about queer people and their supporters. Though I grew up in an affirming household with positive examples of other queer elders and mentors, I still internalized a message of shame around sex and sexuality, both because of churches and society's influences. Still, one of my earliest memories is that of being a flower girl in a gay commitment ceremony back before gay marriage was legalized in Canada. And I still didn't see a lot of people like me in the Mennonite church. In fact, all the people older than me that I knew who were queer and had grown up Mennonite had left the Mennonite church. I lament that had I perhaps received more positive examples of showing love for LGBTQ+ folks in the church, maybe I would have come out sooner or quicker, or been more comfortable to explore gender roles and identity sooner. I internalized fear, even of being seen as an ally. There are three themes I see in these and other stories about queer Anabaptists. First, queerness brings people together in community. From the early days of BMC, queer people in the church were coming together, writing letters, organizing, discerning together, and dreaming about their place in the world, just as the early Anabaptists came together in community around their shared identity and commitments. Second, queerness is an act of nonviolence. Throughout the years, churches and individuals have made decisions to differ from statements and resolutions, to stand out, to risk their livelihoods in order to claim their own and others' belovedness. And third, conversations around queerness have left a need for healing. Many have lost lives, family members, a sense of belovedness and belonging, or livelihoods for living their queerness or queer affirmation. If we as Anabaptists, guided by a vision of healing and hope for the world, care about this vision, healing must be extended to queer people and their families.
Thank you very much, Eliot, for opening up our panel with such a great reflection of the historical context and how your own story weaves in through that. I also want to now introduce our next panelist, and our next panelist is Anita Fast. And I first came to know Anita because we were both serving with Christian Peacemaker teams, as it was called then. Now it is called Community Peacemaker teams. But we had served on the team together in Hebron, and Anita was on team there, and I was a reservist coming in for a short stay. And I just remember in our walks around Hebron having some great conversations. So Anita lives in Vancouver, British Columbia with her wife and 3 teenagers. Anita's educational and work background is in theological studies and administration. She loves spending time with her family and friends, walks in the mountains, forest, or beach, and reading good novels. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Anita.
Thank you. And thank you, Eliot, for sharing. In my response, I'd like to share some of my own story and thoughts in relation to those 3 themes at the end that Eliot noted as recurring throughout queer Anabaptist history. 1, queerness brings people together in community. 2, queerness is an act of nonviolence. And 3, conversations around queerness have left a need for healing. I will also add a 4th, which has been particularly helpful personally for me in framing my experience and my story, that of queerness as an act of faithfulness. To keep the confession of faith in mind while I share these stories and thoughts, I want to start with just a few general comments on how I've experienced the confession. You heard some of this already in Eliot's talk. That really instead of providing guidelines and guidance and building a foundation of unity within and among churches, as the confession claims is its purpose, for myself and for many other LGBTQ people, it has been a hammer of condemnation rather than a guide. It's replaced the lived witness of faith with an unquestionable letter of the law. It's been used to strip people and whole congregations of membership in the Mennonite Church, and it's justified revoking pastoral credentials, barred people from theological study and church leadership. In my personal experience, it's absolutely been part of stoking people's fear and bolstering efforts to silence voices of dissent. It's been a key part of this story of rejection, of loss, of faith and community. And yet, in powerful witness that the Holy Spirit is still active in the Mennonite Church, queer people remain. Actually, let's be honest, it's always been our confession that marginalized and persecuted reveal God's presence. That's what we proclaim of Jesus, the Palestinian Jew killed on Empire's cross. Queerness is such a gift to the church. And with that, let me circle back to the themes that Eliot highlighted. Queerness brings people together in community. This has certainly been my experience. when I first started dating women, I was in my final year at Goshen College, and I quickly connected with a local group of BMC and was exposed to the most delightful, irreverent, kind, and fun-loving group of people. There are a lot of Mennonites in Goshen, Indiana, and so also a lot of LGBTQ plus Mennonites, and we found one another. It was there that I was able to leave the harmful parts of church experience behind without leaving behind community and my Mennonite identity. I'm convinced that God led me out of the capital C church at this time and into what was a living and faithful expression of church, people upholding and supporting one another at the depths of our rejection. There I knew I was loved. There I knew I was blessed. Queerness is an act of nonviolence. The truth of this statement came home to me after having served as a volunteer, as Peter mentioned, with Christian peacemaker teams in Palestine from 1999 to 2002. This was my first experience of a predominantly straight Mennonite community where being lesbian was not seen as inhibiting my ability to be a disciple of Christ. My years in Palestine taught me much humility when it comes to conflicts between people of competing truths. Who was right? Where was God in all this? How could any one of us know with certainty that we had chosen the right path? All these questions led not to answers, but to a discovery of what I consider the root of nonviolence, a complete reliance on God's faithfulness, love, and mercy to us all. An ultimate trust that God could and would find a way towards reconciliation, using our fallible attempts to do the unimaginable and impossible. Queerness is at root nonviolent because it always shifts us away from the center of power and resists the solidification of identity and belief into idolatry and certainty. Queerness is an act of faithfulness. When I came back to Vancouver after serving in Palestine, I reached out to Langley Mennonite Fellowship. With that community, I shared my dream, not of belonging to a church where everyone agreed with one another, but where we could hold competing truth claims because we had faith and trusted one another's journey with God, which is ultimately trusting God's faithfulness to each of us and to the church. If in all faithfulness I could not call something sinful that I experienced to be holy, I was only asking that others trust my commitment to God and God's commitment to me. It sounds rather simple, but that kind of faith makes its demands, which is why perhaps we so often prefer certainty and the lines it draws in the sand. Faithfulness to God and one another requires a reconception of expectation, a redefinition of success, a reliance not on numbers or positions of power, but on forbearance, a commitment to speak our truth, and a willingness to suffer. Queerness is an act of faithfulness because ultimately it embraces the reality that we have nothing but the strength of our own vulnerable selves and our faith that with God all things are possible. Which brings us to Eliot's final point. Conversations around queerness have left a need for healing. The wounds and betrayal suffered by queer Christians at the hands of the church they have loved run deep. I remember a leader of BMC noting years ago that when a church has conversations about LGBTQ concerns, even if they result in the church taking an inclusive stance, they often also result in any queer people who were there at the beginning leaving by the end. Although I did not leave by the end, the 2 years of discernment Langley Mennonite Fellowship went through before deciding by consensus to be a more inclusive community took a great toll on me and was significantly more painful than I expected. There were many times I needed to take space and distance to ask allies to speak up for me when I no longer could. For many years, it felt like I was holding on by my fingernails. This will always be the case as long as the combat zone of so-called discussion makes the most intimate corners of queer lives and bodies the battlefield. As long as this is the case, even wonderfully positive change will come at the expense of those who need it most. If instead churches and conferences were to put community, nonviolence, and faithfulness first, putting the emphasis on the first line of the Confession of Faith, quote, we believe that God is pleased with all who draw near by faith, unquote, there would be no question as to whether LGBTQ plus folks can be participants, members, and leaders in Mennonite communities. Rather, churches and conferences would celebrate with God that after all we've endured, we still are drawing near. We still are participants, members, and leaders. And then all of us could discuss, reflect on, and discern our life together as Christ's body. And no one would assume for themselves the power to excommunicate anyone. I have to say that at 54, I'm astounded by how much has changed in the Mennonite Church from when I first came out 33 years ago. After so many queer years of building community, living nonviolently, standing strong in our faith, and knowing woundedness. I honestly never thought I'd see this day where there are ordained queer Mennonite pastors and young queer Mennonites who haven't been subjected to the spiritual abuse of being told one's loves and relationships are abhorrent to God. And yet, that one infamous line about God's intention for marriage and right sexual union remains part of what the Mennonite Church confesses to know about God. And with one swipe of the pen, so much is scorned, dismissed, and erased. One short line, yet it makes my blood boil and my heart ache still. Some days I am still holding on by my fingernails. In another 50 years, perhaps we'll look back, appalled by the injustices and pain endured by so many along the way, and wonder what took us so long. And yet, today, here we are. The question I'm left with, and which I'd love to pose to all of you, is what do we do next?
Thank you, Anita. What a beautiful witness to your faith and to your identity, and a challenge to us all. Thank you for that question. Okay, I'm going to introduce our next panelist, and here we go. So I'd love to introduce Ness Schattman. Ness has been participating in the Mennonite community since she was 5, including Silver Lake Mennonite Camp and Rockaway Mennonite Collegiate, and she's the class of 23. She led the Rockaway Genders and Sexualities Alliance from 2022 to 2023 and was the keynote speaker at the Beyond Binaries 2023 conference. She's currently studying biology and computer science at the University of Toronto. And in her spare time, she enjoys flute, choral singing, cooking, and nerding out with her girlfriend about the fandom du jour. Thank you so much for being with us, Ness. We look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Yeah, thank you so much to the previous 2 speakers, especially Anita, whose reflection I hadn't heard before. I'm almost tempted to go back and rewrite half my reflection, but here we are. Yeah, so when I read Eliot's article that was given to us beforehand, my first thought was, wow, that sucks. And my second thought was, wow, I knew nothing of any of this. So, some context about me. I am currently in my 2nd year of university, and since I was 5, I've been attending Herb Street Mennonite Church in Waterloo until moving for university. And Herb Street, for as long as I can remember, has been very welcoming towards queer folks. I remember gay couples bringing their kids to church. When my girlfriend came out as trans, I brought her to church without thinking twice about it. And when I myself came out as bisexual in grade 7, I don't even remember caring about what Herb Street would think. So when I read Eliot's stories about the hatred and the fear directed against the queer community coming from within the Mennonite church, it was, I mean, it was baffling. And also, I couldn't really relate to it. And yes, that is a very, very good thing. I am extraordinarily lucky and privileged to have grown up in an environment like that. But at the same time, it's hard to read these stories of queer struggle and queer resilience and resistance without feeling almost a pang of loss. I never knew any of this history. I never knew that my queerness and my Anabaptism, which are two deeply important but seemingly unrelated parts of me, were linked in this way. Why didn't I ever hear these stories? What happened to the queer community that rallied around this struggle? In the church, where are my queer elders and my queer siblings? Now, Herb Street, and I suspect many other churches, have become a sort of neutral ground now, a place for people at Variance to exist quietly and in safety and tolerance. And don't get me wrong, that's a gift that I wouldn't trade for the world. But, you know, is that it now? I believe that this struggle for identity haunts not just queer folks, but Anabaptists as a whole. Our own little corner of Christianity was born from, and in many ways defined by, opposition to the mainstream political and religious authority. Our most iconic martyr, Dirk Willems, is a story of nonviolence in the face of oppression. Our first ever confession was written in a cave with like a couple dozen people in secret hiding from the inquisitors of the Swiss Reformed Church. And I'm not gonna lie, the moment was kind of iconic. Um, I think that queer activists had a lot of these narratives to draw on within the Anabaptist Church. Banding together against oppression brings us unity and identity. But now, you know, as an Anabaptist, centuries later, where no one's getting tortured for being Mennonite anymore, the question is staring at us in the face. What does bring us together now? And in the case of Anabaptists, this is something that the confession can help us answer. In the first webinar that was held a few weeks ago, I was struck by the point about how many different functions the confession has served over the years. And I was especially struck by the point about how carefully the committee to create the current confession crafted it to serve its community's needs at that particular time and place. And in this day and age, as the church becomes more fragmented, one of the functions of the confession is a tool of unity that brings these disparate congregations together. And it doesn't just define us negatively against the world. This is who we aren't. This is how we deviate. It's a positive definition. This is who we are. These are the beliefs and behaviors that have bound us together for 500 years. Adult baptism, pacifism, getting out there and living out our faith by helping the people shunned by mainstream society, being really excited about potlucks for some reason, the list goes on. The confession brings us this positive group identity to unify behind, even as the world has found someone else to pick on. But, as has been brought up in by the previous panelists, you know, does it bring us unity? Like, I would love to turn around and say, well, you know, as queer Christians, we can internalize this message about a positive identity and we can all go home and you guys will all say, oh, yay, she's cracked the code. Amazing. But as Steph's article and as, so Eliot and Anita have thrown into stark relief how Anabaptist identity and beliefs, and this confession itself, has been a way to block queer voices from finding a place in the church. This push towards unity has sometimes led to this sort of both sidesism that has left many queer people feeling shut out of the conversation altogether. And, you know, more to the point, If this confession is a tool of unity, who is it asking me to be at unity with? Yes, many churches have chosen to become more affirming, but many churches haven't. This idea became much more real to me when my girlfriend's church went through the long and as of yet unresolved process of becoming an unaffirming church. It was very painful to me to listen to the speeches and the survey responses calling on the church to label my identity and my relationship as sinful, as inherently deviant. And as much as I felt this kinship with the church, I had to ask myself, is this even a community right now that I can even be a part of? And I don't know. I don't know what unity means in this context. I don't have an easy answer for you, and it's something that I still struggle with to this day. And it's becoming clear to me I don't really have this sort of experience or the connections to be sure. But at the same time, this question is becoming increasingly urgent. In the 80s and 90s, the question of human sexuality was the hot button topic, homosexuality specifically. And in the 2020s, the trans debate is now at the forefront of a lot of powerful people's minds. We are right now witnessing a world where trans people's rights to healthcare and to government services, even the right to just exist in public, is becoming rapidly legislated out of existence. And given the course that we've seen so far, it feels like the situation is only going to get worse, and I'm scared. And, I can doom scroll and I can immerse myself in the suffering of people who I can do nothing to help, or I can agonize about cutting myself off from family members and communities and churches who I love but who choose not to care, or even to participate in the hatred. But in the end, that does nothing for the people who most need the community right now. And it's not how change gets done. So I want to turn my attention away from what not to be. What I would like to close this reflection with is what I want to be and a small vision of hope for the future. As Anita said earlier, queerness is best when thought of as an act of faithfulness. And as Anabaptists, one of our central tenets, one of the things that has always defined us, is to live out this faith. We don't just recite prayers and draft confessions. We don't just quietly tolerate others while the world fluctuates around us. We are more than neutral ground. We are a positive people going out into the world and making change. My dream is of a church that engages actively with its queer community and in queer healing. A church that holds explicit discussions of queerness, queer history, queer Christian stories, queer Christian theology. A church that fosters these connections and the solidarity that I've been missing between generations of queer Christian advocacy. A church that acts as a positive force in the world against queer oppression, engaging in activism, in resource drives, or just being a safe and welcoming space for people who need it. And in the end, I think that's what my dream for unity can also look like in the face of these divisions. Our confession, yes, has a point in a list in a single article that labels homosexual marriage a deviance from God's plan, but this point is dwarfed by the magnitude of the call to treat everyone as beloved people of God and to lift up the oppressed and to act out God's vision for a just world. And if I choose to form communities with other Mennonites, that is what I feel I can still unify under. Thank you.
Thank you, Ness, so much. What a wonderful perspective, as have been all of what we've heard so far tonight. And we will be offering a time for